Hey everyone, I'm Connor, and this is my journey to making my first Swift app. Thanks for joining me. So in the post, I already talked about variables and all that. So the first thing we're going to be building is a structure. We're going to build the shop item structure, and that's going to hold all the variables we need for shop items. Here, the syntax for Swift is pretty simple. We're going to use the let and then shop items, and we're going to use the colon to designate the type. So here we're going to make it an int. We're going to use a let again because Swift likes you to use lets if the stuff's not going to change. And these will be not changing once they're set. So again, there's a double. We're going to have another double here. Oh, sorry, string. Some other strings. And we're going to have a Boolean. And that's kind of how we're going to test some of the basic structures and whatnot. The Boolean's going to play a little bit more of a role later in the app, but just stay tuned on that. So in Swift, we use the init command as the initializer, which is the same as a Java constructor. It's a very similar sort of idea, except the syntax has you leading with the variable name, then the data type. Here, I'm just going to give it a ton of different data types. This is a data structure, of course, and it's going to be representing t-shirts, maybe some other items, depending if I can get more visual stock done in time. But some things that are product static. They're not going to change. They're going to stay the same throughout the whole app. So these things are going to be more useful to pass as values. I actually have a bunch of visual assets that I made during the summer, and we're going to see them next post, but I want to build a little bit of anticipation. If you look over on the right, you can see that Xcode's quite mad at me because I'm not initializing the item right now. So here in the init command, you can see that I'm using the self. This is the equivalent of this in Java. So self equals this dot shop item, and then I'm assigning it the other shop item. This allows us to reuse the names and keep that consistency and coding standard that we're used to. Everything needs to be initialized or it's going to get really mad. And Xcode is a grumpy IDE. AppCode is somewhat grumpy as well. Swift in general, it is a safe type language. So what I feel that means is it is a strong type language, but with more error prevention built in. And now that we have the initializer done, we have our structure built. We're going to jump ahead now, and we're going to start working on the class. So the class we're going to use is cart. Cart is going to hold customer items, and it's going to have a few different functions in it. In Swift, the classes have instant methods, but basically they're functions or methods within the object. So here we're adding the attributes for our cart. So we're going to just have it initialized as a string. And here we're going to have an item array, and we're going to initialize it as shop items. We'll get to it later in the video, but there's actually a few different ways to append and initialize arrays in Swift. So again, we're going to be using the init call or the initializer to set up our class object. So we're going to take in username and string. And I'm not going to take in a value for the array. I'm just going to initialize it during the init process. Again, we're using the self modifier or signature, if you want to call it that. We're using that again because we want to repeat the variable names to get the consistency, as I mentioned. So we initialize the items in cart array as empty just because obviously when you show up to a website, your cart is empty. Here we're adding the first function to the class. We're just going to have a simple function of add item. I don't want the UI to directly modify the items in cart array. I want the UI to call the class object and then the class object be responsible for modifying the array. You can see my Java heritage coming out very strong right here. A little off topic about what we're doing here, but I'd like to say that the syntax from Swift is actually quite nice and concise. I've never worked with one that isn't as grumpy as Java or JavaScript. A lot of the languages I've worked before have, so I feel like everything except for the way that you search arrays is quite elegant. So we're jumping ahead a little bit. The functions I was doing aren't the most interesting to watch. So here you have some of the functions that I made and skipped ahead on. We have the add item. And if you look at the comments, you can see an alternative way to append to arrays. If you look at the remove item function, I haven't implemented any of the code, but you can see the syntax for the return values in Swift. The arrow denotes the value type being returned, which in this case is a bool. We're going to check if the item's in an array, then we're going to remove it, and we're going to return a bool. Same thing we do in Java. Now the card's going to have an instance method or function called getSubtotal. The getSubtotal function is going to use the cart class array items in cart. It's going to iterate through the items in cart, and it's going to return a double to the caller method. So we're going to iterate through the array using a for in loop. You can think of this like a for each loop. The syntax for this is pretty similar almost to SQL, where it's for item or for blank in items in cart. Then we're going to put it in brackets. You still need to use brackets in Swift, but not as much as in Java. Here we're still going to use that addition operator to add the product price, which we're just getting out of the item. This is the same product price as calling it. In Java, you just simply access it almost like a Java bean, and then it's going to return the subtotal. Now we're jumping ahead to the function calc final. This is going to take in the cart and a discount code, and the discount code is a string, but it's an optional string. And we'll talk more about optionals in the next video. As you can see, though, it's going to take in a cart object, and it's going to return a whole bunch of stuff. It's going to return something called a tuple. It's a compound value data structure. It's basically like all the values smushed together, and then you return them to the method that's calling it or the caller object, and all those values come back, and then you would access, let's say, tax rate by assigning the tuple to a var when it's returned and using the var.taxRate. The discount codes are going to be talked about later in the next video because we're going to use something called a dictionary, which is sort of like a hash key array to search for the discount codes. Now, here's a whole bunch of the sample data I made up. We start by initializing a user cart var, and we're going to create some let items. I mean, they shouldn't really change, although the sale might need to be adjusted later. Then we're going to go down and we're going to add these items to the cart, and we're going to check the subtotal, and we're going to do the calc function. Then we're going to do it again with some of the other items. We're going to run it again, check that all these functions line up, and down below here you can see the promo codes and how you initialize an empty dictionary. If you look at them, you can see that it says string, then double. Those are the two value pairs that are associated together. So let's go ahead and run this. We're using Swift Playground, so this is super easy to run. Okay, so here we are. These are the return values. As you can see, it's got all the things I was talking about, like the tax rate and discount. And then we also have the final. So we've tested our code and everything was a success. So here is one of my personal favorite images that I made. This is a little sneak peek you get for watching all the way to the end. So for our next video, we're going to turn the wireframes that you see in front of you into a functioning app. We're going to use original assets that I created for fun. So the next video is really going to be about how we create using Swift UI, how the packages are set up for the application, and error prevention, which is a huge part of Swift. You will find that it runs to the core of Swift. I'm sure you're sick of my voice. I definitely am. So thank you for watching, and hopefully I'll see you for the next one.
Hot dog.